disease caused more casualties in war than illness, than injury. And we first began to realise that after the Crimean War. And the Crimean War was started in 1854, went on till 1856, and that was when Florence Nightingale revolutionised the treatment of injured and sick soldiers. But at the end of the war, it was realised that 22,000 British soldiers had died, but only 6,000 of those had died from their injuries. The other 16,000 had died from illness, and most of that illness was preventable. And so the government thought very hard about this, and they started teaching how to keep healthy to military doctors. And by about the 1860s, military doctors knew the elements of what kept people healthy. They knew that it was important to have safe food and to have clean water and a lot of other things that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But although they knew the theory, it wasn't really getting put into practice. And during the Boer War, which started in 1899 and went on to 1902, about 1 in 10 soldiers developed typhoid, a disease that you hardly ever see these days, and about 1 in 6 of those died. So even 50 years after the Crimean War, nearly, we still haven't really learnt the lesson. So the RAMC really got aboard this, and they appointed 2 military doctors, Dr. Bruce, Major Bruce, and Major Horrocks, to really get teaching in health down to the soldier. It wasn't enough to just teach the medical officers. The soldiers themselves had to know all about how to keep healthy in warfare. And at this stage, nobody knew very much about trench warfare, but they did know that whenever you go to war, you get disease. Now, why should that be? Well, all the things that we take for granted that keep you healthy, like having access to clean water, having safe food, having a roof over your head, having freedom from people throwing things at you that go bang, all that tends to disappear in wartime. And you have a very abnormal set of surroundings that you're expecting people to live in, and you're expecting them to try and keep healthy. And the conditions can be pretty gruesome. So, for example, in the trenches, and if you've been in the trench here, you'll see that most of it's nice and clean and dry. But actually, after several weeks of this sort of rain, you had a mass of mud and rats and all sorts of things. So if you want to just pass that round. And the civilian community didn't fare any better either, because the chances are that their houses, their villages and their towns had been bombed, troops had come through them, and the whole infrastructure was badly disrupted. So buildings had fallen down, water supplies might be cut off, sewage processing might have been disrupted, and there's all sorts of reasons why that provided an environment in which disease could flourish. Then you add on to that you've got a lot of people coming together from different walks of life and suddenly living very, very close together. Now, I think we all know that if you go into a group of people, those of you who at school will know about this, start of a new term, new group of people, everybody goes down with a cold. And you get that if you go on a cruise or any other group of people coming together. Everybody goes down with a cold, everybody goes down with flu, everybody goes down with a tummy bug. And that's because you've got people coming together who are carrying germs that you don't have any immunity to. You very quickly build up immunity to the germs that are in your own environment, your own family. But you've got people coming in from all around, and this happens with the soldiers coming into the battalions and the civilian community as the soldiers came into the towns. And so you had a real hotbed of disease. And then at the start of the First World War, you had very, very few immunisations either. There was smallpox vaccination that had been around for a while. Typhoid vaccination was just starting to come in with the Boer War, but very few people had it. Tetanus vaccination wasn't going to be invented for another 10 years or so, so people couldn't be protected that way. So the only way to protect people was by teaching them how to cope with this very, very abnormal lifestyle. Just to add to the trench picture, if you want to hand that round, that's a picture of one of the villages in France. And you can see just how abnormal that situation is going to be for the people who live there. So, what are the things that we need for a healthy lifestyle? Well, if I was giving this talk and I was talking about how to set up, say, a refugee camp, the first priority, I would say, is to create a safe environment. Make sure that there's no risk of attack, bombing, riots, disruption. Now, in wartime, that's a pipe dream. You can't do that. The very nature of war is that there's going to be things around going bang. And then you say, make sure everybody has a roof over their head. Well, again, in wartime, that's not going to happen. You've got soldiers fighting in the field. They've got to live wherever they can and make do as best they can. But the next most important thing is safe water. Water is absolutely vital to life. You can survive for probably a couple of months if you really try hard without food, but you cannot survive more than about, at the outside, 3 days without water. And yet water, by its very nature, can carry germs unless it's pure. And you also need a lot of water. And people don't often think about how much water the troops on the Western Front needed. Because you had this area of France and Belgium where there was a very stable community, and suddenly, over a fairly short space of time, you add into the equation something like 1.5 million people. You also add in, because they didn't have motor cars, well, not very many, you also add in something like 500,000 horses. Now both people and horses need about 10 gallons of water a day each. So suddenly you need an extra 20 million gallons of water. And any water that you're going to drink is going to have to be pure. It's going to have to be safe to drink. Now that is a huge ask, because there isn't that amount of water in the local community. So you've got to try and get that water from somewhere. How are you going to do it? Ideas? Dig a well, yes. But actually, because of the amount of water that you need a lot of wells, and they need to be able to produce a lot of water. So each well that they dug had to be able to produce something like about 1,200 gallons of water per hour. Now, there were all sorts of problems with the geology of the area, and the aquifers, the layers of rock that are saturated with water that you can get the water out of, were not very good. They didn't have a lot of water in them, and they were quite sandy and quite clayey, so when they did try to suck the water out with a pump, all that happened was that the clay blocked the pump. So they had to develop special pumps that wouldn't block, and they also had to develop special ways of purifying the water that would cope with the sandy, clayey water and put out at the other end safe drinking water. And it was Dr. Horrocks, by now Colonel Horrocks, that the first man setting up the Army School of Sanitation before the war, and he worked on developing a special water filtration system. Now this is a picture of his water filter, the Horrocks clarifier and sterilizer. And lots of these sterilisation units were built. And there were fairly small ones mounted on carts. And there were huge ones mounted on lorries. And all in all, they managed to produce sufficient clean water to cope with the needs of the men and the horses. Now, another thing to look at, of course, is that if you're going to be taking 20 million gallons of water out of the ground every day, and some of that's going to be drunk by the men, a lot of it's going to be drunk by the horses, some of it's going to be used for washing, that's an awful lot of sewage that you're generating. And in a country with completely disrupted infrastructure, that's going to be a big problem. But we're not going to talk too much about that. So anyway, you save water. I had to make sure it was safe. So Colonel Horrocks put his thinking cap on again, and he developed what was wonderfully called the case water testing sterilisation. And hundreds of these were issued out to the troops. And it was always known as the Horrocks box after him. So there we are. Right, so in the trenches, you've got men living in conditions such as we see over there. And I say men because even in today's sort of politically correct world, when we're even thinking about whether we ought to be getting servicewomen to fight in the front line, it didn't happen in the First World War. In the trenches, it was all men. There were a lot of nurses who were working in the hospitals, a lot of female nurses, but in the trenches it was all men. So I'll just talk about men. So you had to enforce very, very strict discipline in the trenches to make sure that people kept the various things that need to be kept separate. What are your risks in the trenches? Well, mud, we can see lots of it over there, rats, overcrowding, contamination of food with all sorts of things. Could just get contaminated with the mud, could get contaminated with the sewage if people weren't good at their latrine duties. So trench plans were produced which made sure that the food was stored in one area, refuse, which attracted rats, was stored somewhere else, the latrines, the field toilets, was somewhere else, well away from where the food was, well away from where the refuse was as well, because you might think you put them together, but actually you don't want rats in the toilets, right. And then your firing bay and the area where the men lived and where they slept could be kept safe. And that was strictly enforced. And the way that it was enforced was by having groups of people called field sanitary companies. And they were a group of an officer and 25 men. And they were trained to patrol the trenches and make sure that everybody was doing everything they should and doing it properly. So there's a couple of diagrams of the trenches. One of them marked up showing in green the areas that had to be kept safe, and in red the areas that were potential hazards like the latrines and the refuse stock. So the field sanitary companies were a new idea very close to the start of the First World War. By the end of the First World War there were 66 of these field sanitary companies, and people were learning. They learnt that if you kept your food and your latrines separate from where the men were living and sleeping, people actually didn't get the same problems that they would have had otherwise. Now, there were other problems in the trenches as well. Lice, for example. Now, lice, body lice, will colonise clothes and they'll hide in the seams of clothes. They like warmth. And they also carry disease. They carry a disease called typhus. And trying to control lice was very, very difficult indeed. And there are pictures of the men sitting in the trench having taken off an item of clothing, using a candle and trying to destroy each louse individually, or trying to just flick it with their fingernails and destroy it. But they were fighting a losing battle. And lice were a huge problem in the trenches. And the water was a problem as well. Although a trench like this, nice duckboards, keeps you above the water, because the trenches were often dug in clay, the very clay that was keeping the water in the sandy beds in the aquifers, but dig the trench down into them, and clay doesn't drain water. So any water that gets into a clay-lined trench is just going to stick there. So you've got this tremendous amount of mud and water, and if you stand with your feet in water for any length of time, you know what it's like. If you stay in the bath too long and your fingers go all wrinkly, well, you imagine your feet going like that, not after 20 minutes in the bath, but after days and days and days. And people got what was called trench foot, and the skin literally rotted on their feet. And you know, it wasn't just like having slightly sore fingers. This was completely disabling, and people had to go into hospital because they couldn't stand. The feet were swollen, the skin was rotten. Thank you very much indeed. So keeping feet dry was a real priority if you possibly could, but it was very, very difficult. So there were all sorts of risks to health that you had to try and manage. But overall, we did fairly well. And there weren't the terrible outbreaks of disease on the Western Front that might have been expected from past campaigns. And it was a real validation of how even in very, very difficult conditions, you could actually cope to the best of your ability. It wasn't perfect. People did get trench foot, they did get trench fever, some people did get dysentery and other diseases. We weren't free of casualties at all by any means, but it was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. And of course military hygiene, the art and science of looking after yourself under difficult conditions really developed after that, and then we started to get immunisation, vaccination, which protected you against a lot of these diseases. So in recent times we have actually managed to reverse that situation of more people suffering from disease than injuries, and we've managed to get disease well down, which is a huge tribute to the work of everybody who's worked in Army Health.